All right, good evening everyone. My name is Dr. Sama Balasubramanian. Thank you for making some time this evening to join us for negotiating your employment agreement, navigating the NTCER. We're going to be talking through a few issues today when it comes to navigating contracts. We're going to be fielding some questions at the very end from you guys. And the aim here is really to keep you appraised as to the basics in terms of employment agreement negotiation, as well as the role of the NTCER in the wider GP Registrar landscape. So the aim here really is to empower you guys with some information and techniques, and for you to go away to different practices and interviews and put these things into practice and feed back to us in terms of how you're going for negotiation as well. So your feedback really drives our process in terms of how things go. And as Rachel, our other host for tonight, who works for GPRA, has noted, sort of what region everyone is from. So it's always important to get the lay of the land, so to speak, and see if we can speak to anything local to your region. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. Pay my respects to the elders, past and present, regardless of what land in Australia you're from. Now, just as an introduction about myself, so I'm a GP working in Wagga, which is a regional town in New South Wales. I sit on the GPRA board as the Registrar Director, and I was a former RLO for GP Synergy for the northern half of the Sydney Basin. I'm also a Registrar Rep on the West Clinical Council. That's one of the primary health networks, or what used to be called a Medicare Local in Western Sydney in New South Wales. And I'm also a member of the New South Wales and ACT RACGP faculty. The aim of this webinar really is to explain what the NTCER is and how that applies to you. We want you to come to grips with common terminology that's used and actually appreciate that this terminology is quite confusing. So finding a way around the terminology so you can negotiate effectively. We want to get you to understand the knowledge of your minimum entitlements, so what you're entitled to. We want to be able to empower you and give you some confidence in that negotiating process. We want to highlight what may be some potential issues in terms of starting employment and how you can navigate that space and advocate for yourself there and try and prevent them from happening, as well as preparing you for your upcoming term process as a whole. So I always like to start with a simple proverb, and in basic terms we always say the clearer that something is, the less people are likely to complain about it, and that's for yourself and also for others as well. So the most important thing when leaving the room after a contract negotiation or an employment agreement negotiation is making sure that both parties are fully appraised and understand what has happened in the room, what the agreement has been, and what the outcome for the next 48 to 72 hours is, whether it's signing a document, whether it's something to be accepted onto your online system, whether you need to go and do a bit of further research. Really comes down to assessing the lay of the land and making that clear together so you both stick to a plan going forward. Presenting to you a couple of common scenarios that people experience. So first things first, you might have an interview at a practice where you develop that rapport as well. They offer you the job. So the practice manager gives you the form and he says, just sign here, we'll see you next term. Another scenario you might have is you've applied to several practices, and this can happen for some people, particularly if you've had a few interviews. It drives a great deal of anxiety waiting to hear if you receive an offer. And so when the notification comes through a few weeks later with an offer from the practice, it asks you to accept it ASAP. And the attached contract simply states as per NTCER. So I'd imagine that the thought going through everyone's mind is, I probably should sign before I end up losing this position I've been given. Because for all of us, safety net of employment is really important. I'd always say stop. So make sure you don't sign on the dotted line straight away. It actually takes a little bit of time, poise, and calm and careful consideration to be able to look through an employment agreement and figure out exactly what you're signing. The important thing to understand is the lay of the land, as I've mentioned. So from our recent benchmarking survey, we found that 3% of registrars did not have a signed employment agreement, and 3% of registrars were engaged as a contractor rather than an employee. So I'll come back to this issue a bit later. If we're looking at the percentage of billings or receipts that people receive, 65.4% are paid the NTCER level. But there is another sort of 28% that's paid above that level, and sometimes that number can increase, particularly with increasing in experience going into your GPT 2, 3 and extended skills terms. But we also note that there's a sort of about a 2 to 3% of individuals who say they're paid under the NTCER minimum. So our role really is to advocate for these individuals and empower them so that you're at least meeting your minimum entitlements. Now, it's important to remember the difference between you working in general practice and working in the hospital system. And this is very important because the funding comes from different places and you're covered by different organisations. So if you're working in the public sector in the hospital, you're covered by what's called the Medical Officers Award. And that's negotiated by the AMA, by the Salaried Medical Officers Federation and the Department of Health locally and federally. Hospital contracts are also standardised. Because we work in private practice and most often classified as a small business, this type of agreement doesn't actually apply to registrars in the AGPT program. So we are actually guided by the NTCER document. So this is what the document looks like. We'll provide a link a little bit later on so you can have a read of it if you haven't seen it already. And I think it's important to have a little read of this document yourself because the NTCER is negotiated every couple of years between GPRA, that's us, General Practice Registrars Australia, and General Practice Supervisors Australia, who advocate for the supervisor's perspective. The Australian Medical Association isn't involved directly in the negotiation, but is present when documents are signed. And this is set in stone for each couple of years to help the training organisations, or the RTOs, enlist practices and ensure registrars achieve fair and equitable conditions in general practice. Now, the NTCER, as I note, was negotiated between GPRA and GPSA and certified by the AMA. It's important to know that this document isn't actually a contract itself. So think of it as being a skeleton document to build your own agreement. It shows you what the minimum acceptable standards are for general practice trainees, and all practices accept to meet these minimum standards when they click your selection through the RTOs, or the training providers. And it covers all stages of registrar training in the GP setting, excluding Defence Force registrars and some in the Aboriginal Medical Services. In terms of the current situation, so if we've been following the local GPRA newsletters and news posts, it's important to note that in this current environment, a new document has not been agreed to yet. So discussions are ongoing between GPRA and GPSA in order to achieve fair and equitable conditions for registrars. So at the moment, as per the current agreement, it rolls over until further notice has been reached and until an agreement has been reached. So that continues at the moment until we get further notice. So if you're negotiating with practices at the moment and they're asking you what happened to the next NTCER, what happened to the next document, you can liaise with your RTO, with us if you'd like, but the main thing is the current NTCER rolls over until the next document comes into play. Whenever you're signing an employment agreement, these are the key things to look out for. So it needs to abide by the NTCER, it needs to spell out your entitlements, and this needs to be clear. Again, the clarity is key. So it doesn't matter what entitlements you note in your contract. If it's not noted with clarity, then it can be interpreted in different ways. So it needs to be set in stone and really something that no one can negotiate in or out of. You do need to extensively review the contract that's offered to you, or we'd call it an employment agreement. So make sure that you take, an hour or two after you receive the agreement to have a little look through it, see if it agrees with you, see if it meets the terms of the NTCER. You can consider a legal opinion if you'd like to, but most of the time people seek the support of their Registrar Liaison Officer or GPRA with us as well if they're unsure of the terms. The important thing to note is what you're signing is legally binding for each 6-month term. So you really need to know what you're signing before going forward. In terms of your own values, so I always say your values must drive the negotiation process. So you need to decide what's most important to you. So is it the practice? So where is it located? What's the teaching, supervision, clinical focus? What about work hours? Do you want to work after hours? Do you not want to work after hours? Can they accommodate specific timings for you? Do you require flexibility because of other employment or other things happening in your life? In terms of leave, so have you negotiated anything about study leave or leave for exams? Is there provision for leave for courses? And what have they noted about holidays as well, and how you can negotiate holidays? And some people and some registrars I've known have actually negotiated holidays well in advance of starting the term and actually have noted it into their contract, particularly around things such as weddings. And also in terms of pay, so making sure that meets the minimum standards and what you've agreed to as well. In terms of some helpful stats, so from the 2014 benchmarking survey, we showed that 80% paid above the NTCER in terms of percentages, and that number has come down over time. In terms of pay frequency, again, there's a variance between fortnightly, weekly, but again, that has changed over time as well, and more people are being paid at the minimum 13 weeks, or we'd say 3-month pay frequency. In terms of billing cycle, so again, that's how often your billings are calculated and reconciled against your salary. So it says that 75% are calculated at 4 weeks or less. 62.5% don't have what's called a restrictive clause or a restrictive covenant. So this actually means a clause that states that over the next X number of months or years, the registrar shall choose not to practice or open a practice in a location within X kilometres radius of the practice. The reality is, and what the advice from RTOs has been, is this is non-enforceable during registrar years, simply as a result of not being able to place restrictions on where you can complete your training. As to the legalities of what happens after you leave the system is very difficult to say. I can't think of a legal challenge that's happened so far. But if you're planning on working in a particular area and you find a restrictive clause in the contract, have a discussion with the practice about exactly what that means, and maybe have a chat to a registrar liaison officer or an RLI from your region, just to make sure you can work that one out and make sure it doesn't place restrictions on where you're going to work later on after you finish training. In terms of work days, we've noted that about 1/3 of registrars never work Saturdays, about 2/3 never work Sundays. And again, it depends on the practice you go to. If you have a practice that's open 7 days a week, sometimes you can leverage input and say, look, I'll work on Sunday, but I want to make sure I get Monday and Tuesday off. Sometimes you can actually negotiate things that way because you're working those hours that other GPs at the practice don't want to work. The other thing is most respondents didn't know if they were paid PIPs or SIPs. So PIPs are called practice incentive payments. So for the practice meeting particular goals over the course of the year, Medicare can pay an incentive payment to the practice. And for the registrar, for completing an X number of services or a particular thing, such as the asthma cycle of care, the practice may be paid X number of dollars, and sometimes you can negotiate your way into receiving a percentage of those payments. The employee versus contractor debate is something we still get these days, albeit less than about 3 or 4 years ago. In basic terms, according to the ATO and federal law, your contract can't say that you're a contractor. You need to be an employee. The reason for this is due to the nature of the workplace relationship. Because you're supervised in practice and because there is someone taking responsibility for your mentorship, education and guidance, they cannot employ you as a contractor or someone independent at the practice. You are employed under their auspices. That also means you're entitled to the National Employment Standards, which is really paid annual leave, paid sick leave, public holiday pay, and superannuation. And if anyone wants a link to the Fair Work documents with regards to that, or some of the old GPRA correspondence confirming that, we can put you in touch with those sources. In terms of normal training hours, so full-time is denoted at 38 hours a week, including 27 hours of face-to-face. Part-time is 14.5 hours a week, including 10.5 hours face-to-face. Now, the difference between the face-to-face time and the so-called full-time time really means 27 and 10.5 are minimum patient contact hours, so minimum time you see patients. In reality and in practice, most of the time your patient contact hours will be closer to the 14.5 and 38 hour mark. But it's important to note that these are the minimum patient contact hours anyway. FTE is a term we use sometimes, so that just means full-time equivalent. So it's a fraction of the 38-hour week to determine a number. So if you worked 19 hours or half of a 38-hour week, we'd call you 0.5 FTE or 0.5 full-time equivalent. Now, some training organisations will calculate full-time equivalents at a 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. Other training organisations will only take a 0.5 and a 1.0. So it is important moving into the next term that you know, particularly if you're a part-time registrar, how your training organisation is going to count your training. So if you're going to work a 0.9 FTE as a part-timer with a training organisation that only takes on 0.5s or 1s or multiples of that, then only 0.5 of your training is going to count. So it is important to be abreast of these circumstances and understand the lay of the land before you enter your practices. In terms of the salary, so the base salary just means the wage paid per hour, and that's independent of how many patients you see. So this is your safety net and this is your guaranteed income. So the NTCER recommends this being paid fortnightly, and that's based on the 38-hour working week. If you are a part-timer, the way you calculate it is you divide the weekly rate by 38 hours and you multiply it by the number of hours you are rostered or do work. So that will tally your weekly pay. And I'll have some figures a little bit later on that goes through exactly what these numbers are. So the important thing here is regardless of what happens in terms of your percentage, your base salary needs to be paid fortnightly. So you need to ensure that you're not only getting paid once every month, once every 2 months, 3 months. So it needs to be paid fortnightly. These are the current figures in terms of base rate, and these base rates of pay have actually gone up in the last 6 months in response to the Medicare schedule increasing their percentages and payments over time. So the base rates have increased from where they were previously, and you'll be seeing some documentation and input from GPRA and GPSA in the coming weeks to months with regards to clarifying this with practices and training organisations, so that this will be an add-in to the existing NTCER to state that the base rate has increased, i.e. changed. So in terms of this, the base rate for GPT-1s are really $75,328.23 per year. That goes up, as you can see, GPT-2, and then it levels out at the GPT-3 level, reaching about $48.95 an hour. All the base rates are also plus 9.5% superannuation. So super needs to be paid on top of the base rate that's noted in this slide, not deducted from it. In terms of the average weekly earnings, again, this is from the most recent benchmarking survey, and it just demonstrates the difference in terms of average weekly earnings for full-time registrar. So again, this is full-time, not part-time. It's very, very difficult to gain meaningful data from part-time registrars simply because we don't get a large enough data set all the time to calculate these numbers. But in terms of full-time registrars, this is where we have it. And as you can see, the trend over time is for that black line to decrease in size and for the green and purple lines to increase in size over time. And that would make sense because as you progress in your training, not only do you learn how to bill more efficiently and may see more patients, but your skills in terms of negotiating and your ability to negotiating further does increase as you gain experience coming through the system. In terms of the base versus percentage, so the minimum percentage in the NTCER states 44.79%, plus 9.5% of that is superannuation. So that ends up being 49.05% of your billings or receipts, including the super. So the percentage is negotiable and can increase depending on your level of training. Because this is a minimum percentage, you cannot negotiate under that. So a practice can't pay you less than 44.79% base rate. In terms of your percentage calculation, so this is your gross billings, again another term you may hear going through the system. This is really anything you bill to Medicare, privately, procedures, work cover, etc. So everything you see patients for. That includes things like care plans as well. It includes the service incentive payments. So these are the payments that I was referring to earlier, and you can search up SIP Medicare on Google and you'll be able to find the first link from the Medicare benefit schedule, and it'll go through a list of those for you. Also, what's called the obstetric and anaesthetic PIP, so you'll get a percentage of that as well. So these are practice incentive payments paid on services you provide in the obstetric or anaesthetic space. My understanding is the anaesthetic ones are purely for the rural generalists or individuals who practice as a GP anaesthetist, whereas the obstetric PIPs may also include some of the shared care money as well. But again, have a look at the Medicare PIPs website to see where you may be able to access some of the PIP funding. The most important thing is when you get to the interview, ask about what your expected remuneration is and talk about your unique and specific skill set and see if you can determine a particular percentage based on your skill set. So we've had registrars in the past who've done a lot of geriatrics work, for example, so they've done a lot of work in the nursing home, and sometimes these registrars have negotiated a higher percentage for seeing patients in the nursing home or a shorter billing cycle, whereas other registrars have negotiated more in terms of shared care for antenatal shared care. So it depends on what you have to offer in that circumstance. The important thing, and I hope the theme that you're getting throughout this presentation is, you need to clarify things at the interview as much as you can so that you know what you're signing when you go home. Again, as I mentioned, in terms of SIPs and PIPs, these are financial incentives paid by Medicare to achieve specific national health outcomes, or to incentivize, I should say, specific national health outcomes. So in terms of the PIPs and SIPs, so PIPs are paid to the practice, except for the anaesthetic and obstetric, which should come to the registrar. And the practice needs to be registered to receive it. So inquire whether your practice is registered to receive PIPs. My understanding is usually most practices are registered to receive it, but there can be anomalies and exceptions in the system. So clarify that when you go for your interview and just make sure that the practice is registered for it. The other thing is service incentive payments. So these are paid to the billing GP. Again, this forms part of that lump sum, part of your gross billings. And these are specific item numbers that you and the practice use. So for example, the asthma cycle of care, if you achieve the requirements for the asthma cycle of care, you get $100 per patient per year. In terms of more info, as I mentioned, there's the PIP, and I'm pretty sure if you replace practice with service, you will find the SIP website as well. So billings versus receipts. So this is also a question I get asked sometimes, and it's important to not use this interchangeably. So billing is simply what you charge when you consult. So if a patient comes and sees you and you charge the 5 to 20 minute consultation item number at 23, which works out to be, I think, $37.05 plus a bulk billing incentive, depending on where you're working. This is really how much income you generate for the practice. Now, the billing really refers to what you send to Medicare. The receipts is actually how much you receive back from Medicare. So in terms of the receipts, the way it works is sometimes the payments for your percentage bonuses can lag because it can take time to receive payment from Medicare, it can take time for work cover to process accounts, and you don't want to be in the circumstance where you end up having Medicare accounts and work cover accounts that are outstanding and may not be paid to you because it wasn't within your percentage cycle, or you may have left the practice by the time you reach that scenario. So sometimes it's worthwhile towards the end of term just making specific notes with regards to things like work cover in terms of your practice and stating you want to follow that up and make sure that that's paid to you appropriately. The reason why this matters is, again, the NTCER allows leeway in calculating percentages on billings or receipts. So just make sure that either one of these is clearly stated in your contract. In terms of knowing what your billings are, you can generate it from practice software. So again, there are different ways of generating this from different kinds of practice software, but generally I recommend either talking to your practice manager, supervisor, or going online onto Google and finding a way to get access to it. And again, there are Google guides for each program as to find your billing reports, and generally it comes under management or reports. Those are the two headings that come under in the software. And it comes in the form of a day sheet. So there's your patient names, the item numbers you've done, and the totals for that. So it's important to note that you are legally entitled to this information. And that's for one very important reason, is you are responsible for what's billed under your provider number. That's regardless of who's using your provider number for what. So when you're in clinical practice, the most important thing I'd say for a registrar to get a hold of from a monetary perspective is getting a hold of how you're billing, how much you're billing, and ensuring that no one is tampering with your billing. So it's not about entering the process with a sense of paranoia or something's going to go wrong. It's really about making sure that you're on top of things from day one and no one can manipulate your numbers. So you're legally entitled to this. You can quote the NTCER if a practice says that they don't want to give you access to this, but usually most practices are quite reasonable and they'll find a way around it. So sometimes if they don't give you direct access to the program, they may have a receptionist or get you to actually print it out at a computer at the front desk every day or every week. So in terms of this, so it's important to note we're paid a salary until a defined period when the practice looks at the income we've generated for them. So if you remember the base rate we were looking at, imagine you're paid every 4 weeks in terms of remuneration. So we're saying every fortnight you're receiving the base rate. So at the 4-week mark, you receive 2 fortnights or 2 base rates worth of pay. Then the practice looks at how much money they've received back from Medicare or how much you've billed Medicare, work cover, etc. And then they calculate whatever the agreed percentage was that you had in your contract. Then they pay you the difference if the balance is higher. So if you made your base rate plus $500, they'd pay you $500 at that stage. If you made less than your base rate, then they don't pay you, there's no difference to pay. You don't pay back the practice because remember your base rate is your safety net. And essentially you can think of that period as being gone. So you can't retrospectively calculate based on a previous billing cycle to balance the books later on. So if you've got a practice that says, well, you've made less in the first 4 weeks and more in the next 8 weeks, and we agreed to paying it off every 4 weeks, they need to consider every 4-week blocks as if you've started at the practice once more and you're a new employee. So just think about it that way. The important thing is it's done at least every 13 weeks as per the NTCER. So it can't be done 14 weeks, 16 weeks, 18 weeks. It needs to be at least every 13 weeks. And I always say financially, it's in your best interest to negotiate a shorter cycle because then your billings will not be diluted. And I'll come back to what that means a bit later on. So in terms of how often these percentages are calculated, again, this is from the latest benchmarking survey. You can find that about a third of registrars are getting it calculated 3 monthly or every 13 weeks. But about 40% of registrars are getting it calculated fortnightly, which is really important. And you'll find that sometimes that'll align with the contractor GPs at that practice as well. Now, this is what I mean by billing dilution. So if you imagine a GPT-1 registrar on that base rate of 44.79% plus super with that minimum 13-week cycle, if you look at the income listed below with 2 weeks of annual leave taken in the middle and compare the earnings, you'll find that if the registrar was on a 13-week cycle, they'll get to $15,228.60. That's how much they'll get in total in terms of that 44.79%. But what will happen is they'll minus the annual leave because that was a base rate that was included within that 13-week cycle. If you were paid in a 2-week cycle block, then what happens is, as I mentioned, you start as a new employee each time. So if you take annual leave over that 2 weeks time, it's 2 weeks worth of base rate paid by the practice, but it's not absorbed into any percentages and not calculated into deducting any differences. So the time you are outside of the practice not generating money for yourself, you're still paid your minimum safety net for your annual leave, which you're entitled to. In terms of work hours, so talking about what constitutes normal work hours, so we talk about patient consulting time, so that's the time you spend seeing patients. We talk about administration time, so that's for notes, phone calls and reports. Teaching time, so that's in-practice teaching time, as well as educational release, which is when you go for workshops, etc. with a training provider. But it's important to know that meal breaks are not included in this time. So it is important, again, to negotiate a meal break into there, knowing how long your meal break is going to be and making sure that you keep that as a meal break and doesn't cut into any of your other time as well because you're not paid a base rate for it. The important thing to note is with teaching time specifically, have a chat to your RTO or look at your RTO or training organisation specific documents with regards to how much teaching time is necessary. So it varies from GPT-1 to GPT-2 and above. But the important thing is to know how much there is, and again, try and negotiate that into your contract as well. So in terms of your work hours, clarifying these things in writing is important in terms of your employment agreement, because then everyone's on the same page. So you need to know your start and finish times. You need to know about reasonable after-hours work requirements. So if the practice states, look, most of the doctors here are doing every fourth or fifth weekend, and they're doing a Saturday for 6 hours, note that on the contract and say, I will do every fourth or fifth weekend and do a Saturday for 6 hours. And that means those are the Saturdays that you'll work, and you'll be able to negotiate out of Saturdays that you either don't want to work or can't make. The secondary thing is also with regards to evenings, and I generally classify evenings as being after about 5 or 6 p.m. So particularly sort of in larger cities, many practices will be open a bit later in the evening or do an evening service. So make sure that this is thought of as after hours, and you actually negotiate those work requirements within your contract. So if you know that Tuesday and Wednesday evenings may be better for you in terms of that, maybe negotiate to work Tuesdays and Wednesday evenings, but as a result of that, have half a session off on Thursday morning. So you can actually try and negotiate and calculate things that way. The secondary thing is also allocated meal breaks. So make sure you note the meal breaks down, and also note how to incorporate administration time. So generally you'll find with practice software, if you haven't been working in practices already, we'll block everything into what looks like an Excel spreadsheet and into either 10, 15 or 20-minute blocks. So it's important every hour or every few hours you block out one of those slots without a patient to make sure you've got administration time. And that's for things like checking reports, catching up on notes, calling family members, calling other doctors, etc. But it is important you block out that time to make sure you've got time to process information. And that's also an important part of the learning process as well as a GP registrar, is having a bit of time to debrief, recuperate, process information and move forward. The other thing is allocate your protected teaching time. So this is why I'm talking about checking the specific teaching requirements with your training organisation and noting exactly what times you'll be thinking of doing it into that agreement yourself. I always say you need to be the one to drive this process, because not everyone is going to do it for you. So you need to be the one sitting down with your supervisor and saying, look, I know that this morning, so Thursday morning is really good for you because I know you've got a skin clinic, etc. in the evening, but Thursday morning you generally have a few patients booked in, but not too many. I'm in on Thursday morning. Why don't we do a train? Why don't we do education at that time? And if you drive the process, generally that also helps your supervisors, who will be very busy as well. Generally that helps your supervisors know which time is appropriate for both of you and helps you both stick to it and meet those requirements. So in terms of an example roster, we're just talking about a registrar working full-time, working Monday to Thursday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. They've got 20-minute appointments with an AM session and a PM session blocked for admin time, so maybe a couple of slots in the AM or a couple of slots in the PM. There's a 30-minute lunch break between 12 to 12:30 p.m. each day, and they've got protected teaching time every Thursday, so 8 to 9:30 in the morning. So making sure that the working week you document on the AGPT form, which is the form you submit to AGPT or Australian General Practice Training, and that's what your training organisation would have gotten you to fill out or will get you to fill out when you accept a contract. That should also be noted on your contract as well. So once you've noted it in stone, again, this is clarity. This is everyone being on the same page. Everyone knows what's going on. So they can pick up this document and say, these are the hours the registrar is working. These are their entitlements. These are the sort of leave dates that they've got planned. These are their meal breaks. This is their administration time. This is how we're going to go teaching. So everyone gets on the same page. So these were a few simple FAQs, and these are questions we received over the years in terms of work hours. So registrars will ask us, what do I do if a practice asks me to work more hours than agreed? Now, you can decline the request to work additional hours without penalty, but I'd always state a little bit of give and take can actually work in your favour. So as I'd mentioned earlier, you'd say, look, we don't have cover for Thursday or Wednesday evenings. Are you happy to work Wednesday evenings? You know what? Sure thing. I can work Wednesday evenings, but I would like to have Thursday morning off. And from that perspective, you may be able to negotiate things. And this is something that just because it's on your contract doesn't mean you can't change your hours later on. But again, it's about having a basic requirement, working to that at the start, getting a feel for each other, building a healthy relationship, and then moving forward from that point. But again, yeah, a little bit of give and take will work in your favour. Some registrars will ask, I'm working every weekend, but my supervisor and other GPs aren't, so is this fair? So we should always recognise weekend work can be a normal part of general practice, but the NTCER specifically states registrar arrangements should be no more onerous than other GPs at the practice. So that really goes with if other GPs are working every sort of second or third Saturday at the practice, it wouldn't be unreasonable for the practice to expect that of a registrar. If instead they'd say, I want the registrar to work every Saturday, then it'd be sitting outside this, outside the auspices of the NTCER, and really would be more onerous than the other GPs. So in terms of negotiating that, again, utilise the NTCER from this perspective, negotiate in terms of that give and take, and utilise the support such as an RLO and GPRA to move yourself forward through that process. The important thing is early on letting the practice know when you can or can't work. So once you've documented those working times on your contract, again, everyone's on the same page. If we're a bit iffy about what the working times are going to be, or we play it by ear or figure out where we're going from here, then it's very easy for parties to misunderstand each other. And really the big aim of us doing this webinar today is really you advocate for yourself effectively so that you can maintain a healthy educational relationship with your supervisor. Because the most important thing in terms of cultivating general practice training is really that supervisor and mentor, supervisor registrar relationship. So that mentor-mentee relationship is the gestation of where you gain your information, where you gain your clinical skills, where you debrief, where you process things, and how you grow as a general practitioner. In terms of public holidays, in terms of public holiday, do I have to work if my practice is open? So if you're normally rostered to work on that day, you're entitled to it as a paid day off. If it's part of your normal rostered hours that's part of your normal rostered hours for that week. If you're not normally rostered to work, you're not paid for that. So if the practice is open and you work that day, you get paid at the base rate and the time you worked as time off. So that essentially means you'd be paid as one full day at the base rate and you'd get 8, say for example, if you're full time, you get 8 hours off as time in lieu to use later on. Or you can get 150% of your base hourly rate of pay or agreed percentage with no time off in lieu. So again, clarify that in your contract. So make sure that you go through the NTCER with your practice manager, supervisor, or whoever you're discussing this with and negotiating with, and then note which of those options you'd like to have. If the practice is closed on the public holiday and you're normally meant to work, then you get paid the usual base rate of pay for the hours you would have worked. And for the calculations for your training organisation in terms of training time, it means that you've actually technically worked that day. So if you're an FTE or full-time equivalent of 1.0 and you work 5 days a week and one of the days happened to be a public holiday and the practice was closed but you're normally meant to work, then you get paid as if you were working at that practice that day, and you also included in your calculation to the training organisation. So you would have still worked 1.0 full-time equivalents for that week. In terms of annual leave, again, under the Fair Work Act, we say that everyone's entitled to 2 weeks of leave per 6-month block. So that's your normal working hours. So if you work 38 hours a week, it's 2 weeks of 38 hours. If it's 19 hours a week, it's 2 weeks of 19 hours. So again, this is regardless of whether you're full-time or part-time. And it's accrued as well. So it may be unpaid if it's taken earlier in the term. That's not the same as sick leave. You're entitled to 5 full days of sick leave per 6-month block, and that's paid from day 1. But annual leave is accrued. So practices may choose not to pay it until later in the term. If you don't use all of your annual leave or you don't use some of it, it doesn't carry on to the next term. So if you don't use it, it's paid out at the end of the term, and again, you don't carry that entitlement forward. This rule doesn't apply if you continue working in the same practice. So if you continue working in the same practice, you can accrue that leave over the next 6-month period. The most important thing is, again, not to assume this is going to happen on its own. You need to drive that process. You need to speak to the practice and say, look, I'm going to stay on for the next 6 months. So, mate, I've got 1 week of annual leave left. Can I take 3 weeks of annual leave in November? I need to go overseas for a celebration or whatever it may be. Then that's a good way of negotiating things. It's important not to turn around to your practice and say, I'm leaving next week for 3 weeks. So that wouldn't be part of being a healthy employee in that system. In terms of being forced to take leave, if the practice is closed for things like Christmas and New Year's, you may be forced to utilise it as annual leave. And this is legal as per the Fair Work Act and happens in many different industries. So the important thing again is thinking of what the big holidays are going to be in the coming term. And I generally think in terms of Christmas and New Year's, if it's the 2018.2 period, for 2019.1, thinking about Easter. So talking about those things early, generally historical trends stay. So having a discussion with practices early and noting it in your contract is the best way of mitigating that risk. So you've discussed that potential for that happening before you commence each term. So in terms of an example of annual leave, so we say a full-time registrar working 38 hours per week will accrue 76 hours of leave, or 10 days, after 26 weeks of employment. Part-timer working 20 hours a week, they'll accrue 40 hours after 26 weeks of employment. So both have accrued 2 weeks of leave based on their usual working hours. So if you're a part-timer and you work 20 hours a week, and you take your 2 weeks of leave, you won't be paid 76 hours or 1.0 FTEs worth of leave at the base rate. You will be paid whatever base rate you would have been paid for those 20 hours per week had you been working at that practice. Now, in terms of annual leave, again, annual leave pay is counted as part of your base salary. So you can think of annual leave as sitting in the practice, earning money, but not seeing any patients. So that's why it dilutes your percentage payment from the other weeks if you're on a 13-week billing cycle. So the way we'd suggest to think about this is initiating a shorter billing cycle, including a note that annual leave is paid separately, or not taking annual leave. And we certainly don't recommend this from a fatigue management perspective. General practice training ends up becoming a lot more hard and onerous, even for registrars leaving the hospital system in sort of quite demanding jobs. And that's because of the nature of the work, as well as the independent advocacy for yourself and the fact that you're often feel quite isolated and alone. So whilst you have external supports, it's not the same as walking the wards and having all your colleagues and friends there in one go. So you will be doing a lot of work on your own. And so it is important to note that annual leave is a good way of resting and recharging for that period. So we certainly don't recommend, from a fatigue management and a well-being perspective, to ever be in a position to not take annual leave. In terms of study leave, again, there's no automatic entitlement as per the NTCER. So in terms of your options, if you wanted to attend a 1-week course, whatever it may be, so some practices might allow you to take unpaid leave and you might utilise your annual leave instead. The important thing to note is really written exams occur at the start of coming terms, and this is with regards to the RACGP, similar for ACRM as well, I will say, but certainly for the RACGP. So make sure you discuss these leave plans in your negotiations based on when you want to sit exams. Now, I will say things don't always work out like you want them to do. Sometimes you won't end up sitting exams where you thought you'll sit exams. Sometimes you'll need to do particular courses to maintain skills, and this can be true for registrars taking up rural skills terms, doing terms such as anaesthetics, emergency and obstetrics, and those registrars are also entitled to some external assistance from either the state government or some of the training organisations in terms of funding. But at the end of the day, in terms of timing and leave, it usually turns out to be either unpaid leave from the practice or utilising annual leave. The most important thing is ensuring that this leave doesn't interfere with training time or the ability to sit examinations. So if you're in a circumstance where you have to take more than the required amount of leave, so that's more than 2 weeks of annual leave and perhaps 5 days of sick leave, at the end of the day, I'd be having that discussion directly with supervisors, directly with medical educators, to make sure that you don't stop yourself sitting an exam that either you've already paid for or you've planned to sit, because otherwise that'll delay everything by 6 months' time. In terms of other kinds of leave, so again, under the NTCER and Fair Work as well, we talk about sick leave. So this is called personal or carers leave. And the reason it's called personal or carers leave is because you don't actually have to be sick in the traditional sense or the stigmatized or stereotyped sense in order to access it. So you've got 5 days of paid leave for that 6-month block, as I mentioned. And again, you're entitled to that upfront. So this is unlike the annual leave, which needs to be accrued over the term. But again, in my experience, most practices will just pay your annual leave as per the base rate, regardless of what you've accrued. But personal and carers leave should be paid from day one. And it's called personal or carers leave because you can take it as a carer certificate, you can take it as a personal certificate, you can take it as a sick leave certificate. In terms of compassionate leave, so this is also noted in the NTCER, it's 2 days of paid leave to spend time with a member of the immediate family or household who is ill. That's paid at the base rate. And I generally say in terms of compassionate leave, we're talking about a de facto spouse, brother, sister or other sibling, mother, father or other parent. So these are usually what we're looking at. And also, I should say, sorry, sons, daughters, and other children. So really, if you imagine a family tree, I generally say one spoke across is where the auspices of compassionate leave goes, but I'm not sure if legally it's been tested much further. In terms of parental leave, as per AGPT policies. So I should go back to the parental leave just for a second. Again, there's different categories of leave when it comes down to taking time off in GP training. There's category 1 leave and category 2 leave. These are under the Australian General Practice Training requirements. Okay, Kevin has also noted, yes, I believe grandparents may actually be noted under compassionate leave, but I'll need to go away and check that. But I certainly know one spoke across in the family tree is covered. So in terms of AGPT policies, I would suggest looking up AGPT and then leave and looking up the policies on the General Practice Training or Australian General Practice Training website to denote if you are going to take some time off as either parental leave, so paternal or maternal leave, or taking off an extended period for another, for another reason. Because those are the circumstances where you have discussions directly with your training organisations, usually via your medical educator and your RLO, Registrar Liaison Officer. And it's important to try and plan those things in advance as much as you can, because you don't want to be in a circumstance where you don't have enough time to finish your training, or you're really looking at the last block of time that's permitted to you before you can pass exams. So you want to have as much time behind you as possible to make sure that in the unlikely event that you may or may not get through your hurdle examinations, that you can actually negotiate for extra time. So in terms of educational release, again, it's a common thing we get asked. So full-time registrars are paid at the base rate for attendance. So if you're working 4 days a week and you get called to go to a workshop with your training organisation for 2 days of that week, then you're paid at the base rate for that attendance. And similarly, think of it as being like annual leave. You're not present in the practice, but you're doing something else. You get paid at the base rate for that time, but you're not seeing patients, and therefore you're not moving into the percentages. So again, that's potentially absorbed into the billing cycle. We get into murky waters and difficult waters for part-time registrars, because part-time registrars are paid this release at half the rate of full-time registrars. It's not paid at all if it occurs on a day you're not typically rostered to work. So if you're rostered to work a Monday to Wednesday and education release falls on Thursday to Friday, then you're not paid to attend it. So it's important to indicate at the start of the term which workshops you're planning to attend so you can plan your days ahead. So making sure that you do get paid at least half the rate for the days you do attend. So again, that comes down to that forward planning, knowing which days you're going to work, and having a discussion with the training organisation to figure out what their education timetable is and figuring out which workshops and training parts you're going to do next. So again, the time it's not paid for everyone, that's weekends or after hours. And the other thing is for general practice training 3 and above. So with term 3 and above, there's no mandate in terms of educational release. So it's important to note that really you're entitled to be paid for it. The RTO pays all practices an amount for your attendance to these days. So they pay practices a set amount at the start of each term for taking on a registrar and attending educational release. So If, and then the only other thing I'd say is if and only if you're working 38 hours over 4 days of the week and the education release happens to fall on your unrostered day, and again, this comes under that fatigue management clause. We talk about this in terms of instead of being paid for that day, you might take time off in lieu the weekday directly before or afterwards. So the rationale for this is to prevent excess fatigue. So this really comes down to negotiating about how much work you're going to be doing in a week, making sure you've got that time to rest, relax, re-energize and debrief. So really this clause is there to protect full-time registrars who may have more onerous hours by having educational release outside of their regular time. So Ruani has asked, do GP practices have their own education timetables, or is this an AGPT thing? So AGPT really set a lot of the policies with regards to GP training, but the education timetables lie with the training organisations. So the RTOs have their own education timetables, and these are generally prepared by the start of the term or sometimes even before that. So you may be able to access the coming terms one before you actually do your negotiations. In terms of the practices themselves, you need to negotiate within the practice hours when they're going to do education for you. In terms of superannuation, so yes, you're entitled to this. And again, this is one of the benefits of being an employee, not being a contractor. So superannuation is 9.5% of the gross billings or receipts. So whatever you're paid, 9.5% on top of that is paid as superannuation. So just make sure, again, most practices either just follow the NTCER wording for this section, but just make sure that the 9.5% is clearly noted so that it's stipulated in your contract and everyone's on the same page. So again, with the super, NTCER states every 3 months, but you might negotiate to happen a bit more frequently than usual. So the super paid on the percentage? Yes. So if the percentage is higher than your salary, then your super is paid at higher than the base rate. And it's calculated as a proportion of the difference. So when that bonus payment is calculated. So let's say you're earning this amount or X amount in your base salary, and you end up with a $3,000 difference between your base salary and your percentage payments. So the difference to be paid to you is $3,050 as your percentage bonus. So you're paid super on top of that percentage bonus for $289.77. That's in addition to the super you should have already received on your base rate. So again, whatever you're paid, super must be paid on top of that. There's also a little bit about some of these special or restrictive clauses within the NTCER. So as I mentioned earlier, that's about that covenant. It's about restricting you in terms of where you can work. Now, as I mentioned, cannot interfere with your training requirements, but there may be a role for legal enforcement after you finish your training. Again, in my experience, I haven't seen it done, but I really speak to the New South Wales example and some of the sort of close by states. But it is important to sort of have these discussions, perhaps with your medical defence organisation, about where your restrictive covenant may place you. But most of the time, as I suggested, have a discussion with the practice early on. See if you can remove that from a contract if it's present. See if you can modify it if necessary. But just make sure that you understand the meaning of this before you finish your training. Again, it's very rare to get something called a binding covenant, and this is the flip side here. So a binding covenant is rare, and it stipulates that when you fellow, you must work for the practice. So again, search for a binding covenant through your contract as well. And again, we're not talking about this in terms of these are the problems that you are going to face or come up against or being paranoid about these things. It really comes down to understanding your employment agreement so you can effectively advocate for yourself. When you feel empowered and you're an effective advocate for yourself, then you can build upon that, generate some independence and competence within your practice, and work on developing a healthy supervisor-registrar relationship. Now, Edwin has asked a question saying that several practices have said or been deducting super from the total billings. Is this allowed? No, it's not allowed. So super needs to be paid on top of what you deserve. So in that circumstance, again, the billing percentage would be created, the difference would be paid between the two, and super would have to be paid on that billing percentage difference as well as the base rate. If you know or are in that circumstance, please refer that on to your registrar liaison officer, medical educator, and also possibly to GPRA with us as well as whether there's a practice manager that works for their training organisation. Because in that circumstance, it shouldn't be happening and should be dealt with immediately to make sure that the registrar isn't underpaid. So as I alluded to earlier, when we talk about steps to take when you're negotiating your contracts, we want to talk about your research. So that's finding about practices in the area you want to work in. I generally recommend to registrars that I see, if your training organisation has what's called a placement portal with practice reviews, that can be a good method of finding out some positive feedback about the practices. But sometimes practices have veto over the information or feedback that's applied to RTOs. So that means that the information about the practices on the RTOs may only have a positive predictive value and therefore may be a false positive within that system. So I'd also be looking at other sources of feedback. So that's on the grapevine from other registrars that have been there, through Facebook pages from your training organisation, and maybe even asking the expertise of your RTO or even a current supervisor in terms of those other practices as well. The key features I always talk about, and the reason I don't mention money here, is really the softer skills and the quality elements of general practice really come down to that mentorship and that healthy supervisor-registrar relationship. So we're really talking about teaching quality, supervision, what hours you're open, and the feedback from other registrars. So sometimes not having a higher percentage early on can benefit you in terms of your long-term growth and development, as long as you're at the right practice. But that's different from saying that you don't deserve to be paid a minimum rate or a safety net in order for putting in the effort and work at the practice. And you must be treated as a fellow employee and a fellow colleague, as opposed to an underling or a junior. In terms of steps to take, I always suggest considering and preparing your cover letter quite well. Make sure that your CV or your resume is up to date. Shortlist the practice based on the requirements that I mentioned earlier, and think about pros and cons. And pros and cons list are basic things with regards to, hours that are open, number of patients, what the training quality is like, but also about the pros and cons for you. And sometimes the pros you may find may be cons for other people. So it's about working out what you want out of the training practice. Familiarise yourself with the NTCER and some of those associated resources like the AGPT documents, your RTO timetables for education, etc. And really sort of think and do some introspection into what is important for me and what are the things I'm willing to compromise on. Again, you shouldn't compromise any further than the safety net. That wouldn't be legal in this circumstance. But certainly compromising in one department can get you gains in another department. And these are an important part of the skills that you learn, because you will be negotiating contracts, etc., over the course of your careers in general practice as well. We always talk about a top 3 list in terms of what you want to negotiate. So it might be your work hours, might be the percentages, billing cycles, weekend work and leave, and know which terms you want to push hardest for. In my experience, particularly in the early terms, it's really the billing cycle that makes the biggest difference. I always find in terms of percentage is one of those things which comes down to the philosophical discussions about how much we deserve to be paid for the work that we do. And everyone's going to have a differing opinion on this. So when we talk about achieving equity in the workplace, we're really saying other contractors are being paid at 2 weekly or 4 weekly auspices. Why can't we be paid at 2 weekly or 4 weekly auspices? That would make sure that my annual leave doesn't get absorbed into my billings, etc. So from that perspective, I always say the billing cycle is really the one to work towards, as opposed to an increased percentage. In terms of weekend work and leave, as I mentioned, it's really that give and take scenario. And sometimes an important way of moving forward is not just considering what leave you're taking, but actually asking the supervisor, well, what leave are some of the other doctors taking in the practice? Are there particular times of year you want me to work a little bit extra, and then other times where I can take a bit of time off? So these are some ways of sort of making sure you know which terms you want to push hardest for. And that's what makes this process so fluid. And when you go and see the supervisor, make sure you've printed out the NTCER We've got a sample agreement template on the GPRA website, and we've also got an essential negotiating checklist. So these resources can be found at that link, gpra.org.au/NTCER. So being informed and being organised is the key to registrar empowerment in employment negotiations. It is also important to not sell yourself short, so be enthusiastic. Let the practice know what you can offer them. Show them you are flexible and you're willing to compromise. So you can aim high, but know what you're prepared to walk away with. Remember to keep the terms on paper and write them down together. So again, similar to patient notes, if it isn't written, it didn't happen. And this is what I mean about gaining clarity within this negotiating process. It needs to be down on paper. So you need to sign to it. You need to put it according to the dotted line. So if it isn't on paper, then it's not something that happened. In terms of signing on that aforementioned dotted line, we really talk about reading the contract, reading the fine print. And I always say, we use the term fine print, but really I say there's either print or not print. And the good thing about employment agreements is they aren't like iTunes fine print. You know, they don't go for about 40 or 50 pages. So it really is important to read through the print on your document, make sure that it meets the minimum terms in terms of the NTCER, and it also clarifies all those things like working hours, leave, education, etc. And the important thing is to sign only if you are comfortable with the terms. Now again, comfort is a bit of an iffy word to use in this scenario. Some of us are a bit more anxious or worried about these things or have less experience in this department. And that's where I'd suggest utilising the expertise of your colleagues and also your Registrar Liaison Officer and GPRA, because they are people that can actually go through these things with you. So we can go through these things with you and then ensure that you understand what you're signing for from this perspective. If you're an AMA member, you may be able to utilise their legal team or industrial relations team, but not all of us are AMA members either. In terms of asking for help, again, can contact GPRA at the following email address. So that's for the employment and contract advice, support and more. The AMA professional services team, if you are a member, can help review those contracts. And most importantly, remember your Registrar Liaison Officer. Most problems and most conflicts are resolved at the local level, as long as communication happens early and happens effectively. So if you find that you've been handed a contract and you're not quite sure what it means, and you're sitting on the fence with regards to signing a practice, and you say, look, I think this meets the NTCER, but I just can't quite interpret it properly, have a chat to your RLO. They may be able to shift your focus and help you clear your mind. And once you have that clarity of thought, you'll be able to come to a decision that you'll be happy with. In terms of important resources, again, stressing the NTCER. Read the NTCER, and there's a link for it. So gpra.org.au/NTCER. On this page, you'll also see that employment agreement template that I mentioned, the negotiation checklist, but also a benchmarking survey, the negotiation guide, some of the frequently asked questions, an explanation of the key terms, list of things to consider, and a lot more there as well. So it's a wealth of resources you can use to help yourself advocate for yourself in practice. The other important thing is valuing yourself. The main thing when it comes to the next 6 to 12 months when entering a new contract and entering a new practice really comes down to what you want to get out of the practice experience. It is important that you value yourself and you value the skills you bring to the table. Negotiate using those skills. If you did an obstetric term and you were quite good at obstetrics and they offered you a job, for example, talk about it at the practice. Tell them that I'm quite good when it comes to obstetrics. I want to do the shared care course. I want to do a bit more of that. Can I get a higher percentage for seeing antenatal patients? So there are ways of valuing yourself in terms of those small skills and things that you have, where you may be bringing a large deal of benefit to the practice. The other thing is seeing yourself as a colleague within the practice model. So when it comes to employment problems, when it comes to money, when it comes to sorting out education release, think of yourself as a colleague within the practice environment. So you're just another one of the general practitioners there that gets paid similar to the other general practitioners there. And you deserve to be treated as other general practitioners will be in that practice. The other thing is making sure that you're able to have clarity in terms of your employment negotiations so that you can adequately preserve and you can allow that relationship between yourself and your supervisor to flourish. So the last thing you want are employment terms and conditions to get in the way of a healthy and fantastic educational relationship. So that's why I'm talking about valuing the softer sides when it comes to negotiation. What hours am I going to work? Who am I going to work with? What patients am I going to see? When's my education going to be? What topics are we going to cover? These are the things that really drive processes forward, and there's no substitute for a healthy work environment. So your aim here really is learning how to negotiate to find a successful and healthy work environment. That's really where you're going to flourish best. I should always note in terms of GPRA, so General Practice Registrars Australia, and as I mentioned, I'm a board member here, and I was a Registrar Liaison Officer for 3 years, so working quite closely with GPRA during this period. So GPRA offers exam and learning support, so this is everything from resources to linking you up with study partners, doing some advice, and also webinars as well. Employment support, so in terms of negotiations, job opportunities, and advice. The other important thing is really advocacy, so advice, support, and political representation. Many of you who are existing general practice registrars may have noted recently with regards to the NTCER, etc. And so really we are your advocate and we are your voice. And our aim really is to be a voice for the voiceless and a face for the faceless. So if you'll find you're someone who doesn't feel like they can advocate for themselves, is not sure of the right communication pathways and channels to go down, we are really your source of education, source of knowledge, and source of advocacy. So we're here not only to make your life earlier, but also to improve the general practice landscape for registrars, supervisors alike. And again, our ultimate goal is achieving that healthy registrar and supervisor relationship. That's what we all work towards. The other element is with regards to wellbeing support and also events. So running conferences, we also run some workshops in different states with regards to educational skills and also networking events and cocktail nights as well. And that's through regional training organisations at the same time. So I would always suggest if you're a registrar, it's important to become a GPRA member because by contributing to the voice of general practice registrars, you will make that voice stronger and you will advocate for a better future. Very good. So thanks very much, everyone. So I think we'll leave it at that. Again, you've got our email address in terms of getting back to us. So that's all the time we have. And at the end of the day, yes, really, this is a difficult process and a difficult time for registrars. You've often come out of a hospital system where everything was sort of done for you, just sort of signed on the dotted line. Things change a lot when you enter general practice. But at the end of the day, this presentation really is to give you tools to understand the process. Once you understand how employment works and how to negotiate employment agreements and how the NTCER fits into all of this, then you'll have a way to step up and advocate for yourself. And as I mentioned, we're here as your advocates as well. So thanks very much, everyone.